Racine, Wisconsin, so I've just been surrounded by it my entire life.
Cool. Well, hi everyone, I'm JR. I'm a senior at St. Mary's College of Maryland. I'm a history major. I will be graduating this spring, and I'll be starting their Master's in Teaching program this summer. I am going to pursue a career in education, teaching elementary, but I plan to pursue my graduate studies as a historian in later years, and my research, as you'll see, is on hardcore punk rock in DC in the 80s. And that's that.
So she was going to, oh.
We're having trouble logging in.
Gotcha.
Did someone start presenting?
Well, does anybody not have a non-technical presentation? Then we will start with Mark. That's good, because that goes in order then.
So as I said, my topic is on jazz and ragtime, and particularly why it was received and what its appeal was to white audiences. So jazz legend and trumpeter Wynton Marsalis once stated, and I quote, "Jazz music is America's past and its potential, summed up and sanctified and accessible to anybody who learns to listen, to feel, and understand it. The music can connect us to our earlier selves and to better ourselves to come. It can remind us of where we fit on the timeline of human achievement and ultimate value of art. Jazz in many ways is a purely American musical form, and as such has developed an identity of one of the great art forms in American culture. A key question that arises from this notion is, why did jazz and its predecessor ragtime become so popular in American, particularly white society? This is an especially important question when considering that jazz and ragtime were amongst the only African American art forms that were widely accepted by whites in the United States. Some authors have argued that the constant interplay between white and African music is responsible for jazz and ragtime's popularity. Others argue that ragtime's roots in minstrelsy played a key role. I, however, believe these two explanations alone are insufficient. Rather, I think that the reason that ragtime and subsequently jazz became popular was because of its familiarity to white audiences because of its roots in minstrelsy and the combination of white and African styles intermingling during the antebellum era. Also, the innovation of vinyl records and the abilities of music companies to market specifically jazz opened the genre to a new white audience that would have never previously been exposed to it. It is first important to highlight ragtime's roots and how that influenced its eventual popularity amongst white audiences. Ragtime's roots can be traced back to the colonial period of American history, and more specifically can be traced to two distinct styles of music. The earliest direct roots of ragtime come from the music of West Africa. Stylistically, African music during the American colonial period was characterized heavily by syncopated rhythms and call and response vocalizations. Thematically, the songs were mostly Christian spirituals, incorporating the Christianity of their masters with the music of their ancestors. Unsurprisingly, African slaves brought their music with them to the United States, and in some cases even performed their music publicly. An example of this type of performance can be found in the travel journals of Benjamin Henry Latrobe, a British architect traveling from Philadelphia to New Orleans in 1820. In this journal, Latrobe describes the dancing and singing styles of the slaves, as well as mentions the instruments that they were playing, namely, and I quote, 2 drums and a stringed instrument, which no doubt was important from Africa, end quote. Very likely, Latrobe was describing the banjo, which makes his account one of the earliest to cite the use of banjo in African American music. Ragtime also has roots in British folk music, which was popular within many regions of the United States in the early 19th century. Very simply, the melodic structure of these British folk songs is very similar to ragtime, without the emphasis on syncopation as the rhythmic structure. Also, in comparison to the music of West Africa and of early slaves, the British folk music that was popular in the United States in general contained secular themes. In conjunction with the actual music theory behind British folk music, it is important to look where geographically these songs were popular within the United States, because they were certainly more popular in some regions of the United States than others. British folk music and subsequently the blues from which ragtime sprang were widely popular in the South and in the Appalachians, while not being very popular in the North. As such, it is no coincidence that ragtime saw its initial popularity in the South and in parts of the Appalachians. Ultimately, however, the roots of ragtime in West African music and British folk music shows that white and African musical styles were interplaying with each other from a very early point, which helped to create a uniquely American style of music in ragtime. As slaves became more distant from their West African roots, so did some of the themes of their music. Slave music by the late 1820s through the 1850s was generally more secular in theme than the music of their ancestors. As the slave songs became increasingly more secular, so too did their intertwining with white musical forms, and many whites in the South took notice of this fact. For example, in 1839, a woman named Fanny Kemble, in her journal entitled Journal of Residence on a Georgia Plantation, described how she heard strains of the French song A vous dirige maman and the Scottish song Coming Through the Rye distinctly in slave songs. Despite the incorporation of white styles into slaves' music, white Southerners generally viewed such performances very negatively. The aforementioned Benjamin Latrobe very clearly viewed the slave performance in New Orleans poorly, calling it, and I quote, brutally savage and at the same time dull and stupid. Latrobe was seemingly not alone in his sentiments during this time period through the 1840s and well into the 1860s. In describing the same style of performance in the same square in New Orleans, in 1845, Edward H. Durrell, then the mayor of New Orleans, using the pseudonym H. Didymus, held similar views to Latrobe, calling the songs that he heard, and I quote, uncouth and detestable. So while slaves clearly began to incorporate white styles into their music, which is an aspect of African American music that is key to unlocking its eventual reception by white audiences, prior to the Civil War, whites still generally viewed slave music as brutish and distasteful. There are clear exceptions to the ideas that whites generally dislike slave music, however, including Louis Moreau Gottschalk, a composer from New Orleans. In the 1850s and 1860s, Gottschalk was one of the most important American composers. Gottschalk was clearly familiar with slave music, which he learned from his black slave nurse Sally when he was a young child. The influence of slave music on his own music is distinct, as Gottschalk notably used Afro-Caribbean rhythms and traditional African drums in the banjo in his compositions. These rhythms often incorporated syncopation, and many historians regard Gottschalk's work as instrumental in the foundation of early rags and cakewalks, a dance style that's closely associated with minstrelsy. Gottschalk helped spread African American music to a wider white audience, and it is thanks to his music in part that public opinion began to shift more positively of African American music throughout areas outside of the South. African American music also gained a following amongst white audiences through minstrelsy, another important predecessor of ragtime. Minstrel shows were characterized primarily by the performance of white actors in blackface, who typically portrayed African Americans as dim-witted and in a comedic manner. While extremely racist by today's standards, minstrelsy in many ways opened up African American music to white audiences, as African American musicians worked with these white actors to put on the shows by composing much of the music that was performed. In order for these shows to become popular, however, the music had to be, and I quote, whitened, unquote, as historian Vera Lee describes, meaning that the music of the African American composers had to stray away from the music of their peers. By the 1860s and 1870s, African Americans began to act in their own minstrel shows that were often sponsored by white businessmen. Despite African Americans becoming the predominant minstrels during this time, the stereotypes that minstrelsy perpetuated continued to be displayed on stage. For example, Vera Lee describes that numerous African American minstrels would use blackface and retain the caricatures of African American life that whites had portrayed before them as a means of making a living. Bearing in mind that the effects of minstrelsy on African American performers seems overwhelmingly negative, minstrelsy did also have many positive effects. First, it provided an outlet for many famous African American songwriters to reach a white audience, such as W.C. Handy and Scott Joplin. In addition, minstrelsy opened up white audiences to the jigs of African Americans that would eventually transform into ragtime. So while minstrelsy created an embellished caricature of African American life, it did provide a means for African American musicians to perform their music in front of white audiences that would inevitably help ragtime strike a chord amongst these audiences as well. Jazz's origins are much less obscure than its predecessor, ragtime. Early jazz, or hot jazz as it is now called by music historians, was heavily influenced by ragtime both stylistically and rhythmically. As jazz historian Mark Gridley explains, however, ragtime alone did not influence hot jazz. Gridley points to the influence of European dance music in early jazz, especially in New Orleans. As he points out, and I quote, European dance music played a strong part in the music culture of New Orleans, and it could easily have been absorbed in the evolution of jazz, end quote. Gridley also cites the blues and West African and slave songs as heavy influencers of jazz as well, but arguing that ragtime and European dances are the largest stylistic influences on early jazz. Despite the major similarities between jazz and ragtime, there are a few key differences between the two. First, jazz features improvisation as one of its defining factors. In a musical context, improvisation is spontaneous and unrehearsed musical notations, basically meaning that the musician plays whatever notes that he or she wants to, as long as they fit into the melodic structure of the rest of the song. Also, unlike ragtime, which is almost exclusively played on the piano by individual performers, jazz generally is played in trios on the smallest scale or full-size orchestras on the largest scale. The instrumentation of jazz is different from ragtime too as a result. While ragtime dropped the brass and woodwinds that white band leaders, notably John Philip Sousa, embraced, jazz, through its influence by European dances, reintroduced some of these instruments such as the trumpets, trombones, and saxophones. Ultimately, while ragtime did influence jazz very heavily, jazz in many ways shows its European roots through instrumentation and style. Jazz, in comparison to its predecessor ragtime, also had a much easier time gaining widespread critical acclaim amongst white audiences for a myriad of reasons. For one, jazz in many ways had a ready-made, built-in audience from its onset because of the style being a descendant of ragtime. By the time jazz was forming, roughly between 1905 and 1915, ragtime did have a fairly widespread audience, thanks in large part to the efforts of Scott Joplin. This fact alone would have given jazz a distinct advantage over ragtime in terms of it reaching a widespread white audience in its formative years. Also, by the mid-1910s, vinyl records were becoming more widely available to the public that could afford them, which were mostly white. Many jazz musicians took advantage of the new opportunities that recorded music afforded them, which also gave jazz a distinct advantage over ragtime in terms of reaching a mainstream audience that could listen to jazz without having to go see the musician perform. The fact that jazz was a descendant of ragtime, the emergence of vinyl records and music were not the only advantages that jazz had over ragtime in reaching a white audience. Many ragtime musicians crossed over into jazz music. In fact, many notable jazz musicians who were instrumental in creating jazz as we know it today started their careers as ragtime musicians. One of the most notable of these musicians that started out playing ragtime and transitioning to jazz is Jelly Roll Morton, the self-proclaimed father of jazz, who, despite the claim being clearly false, was instrumental in popularizing jazz across the United States. By the 1920s and into the 1930s, jazz had carved out a fairly sizable market amongst young northern whites, due in large part to the introduction of the radio and the symbolic nature of jazz as countercultural during Prohibition. However, with the rise of many powerful music companies such as MCA in the 1930s, jazz was able to grow to a national and in many cases global scale. The increased production of vinyl records, recording studios, and the widespread ownership of radios opened jazz up to markets that had never heard of it before. This is thanks in large part to music corporations. The key caveat to keep in mind, which historian Thomas Hennessy articulates, is not so much that numerous areas were unexposed to jazz by the 1920s. In fact, jazz was likely widely known by most Americans by this time, and evidence points to its popularity throughout the country. A change that came from the music companies was that individual musicians were introduced to the public on a national and global scale, unlike anything that had been seen in the world prior. Ultimately, jazz was already fairly popular before the rise of powerful music companies. However, these music companies helped give individual musicians national popularity using new technology such as the radio and vinyl records that allowed music to be heard without going to a performance. While companies such as MCA did give new opportunities to African American musicians, however, these companies, and MCA in particular, geared their businesses towards white audiences. In conclusion, ragtime and jazz were well received by white audiences for many reasons once they gained sufficient exposure. Throughout the history of African American performance, African American musicians in many regards did change their style in order to reach a wider white audience. The reason behind this is simple in that white audiences had money to spend more so than an African American audience during this period. This reality can be seen in the fact that many important ragtime and jazz performers got their starts in minstrelsy and vaudeville. Minstrel shows especially demonstrate the lengths that African American performers were willing to go to make money, given that minstrelsy often played into African American stereotypes held by white audiences and were, by today's standards, overtly racist at their core. However, the pandering and tailoring of music to white audiences was not always negative. The incorporation of European styles into African American music gave jazz and ragtime distinct sounds that helped create the genres that have become one of the great American art forms. Thank you.